The useless one, the cursed one, the broad one nobody will buy. That was how they spoke of her in Jalapa, in the year 1791, just before a widowed hacienda owner bought the mocked captive for 15 cents and changed the fate of everyone who laughed. Stay with me, because before this story reaches its vindication before witnesses, you need to see the moment when a whole market judged her worthless, and one grieving man did not. By midday, the slave block was already thick with heat and trade. Burnt molasses hung in the air. So did sweat, sea salt carried inland from the port roads, brazier smoke, and the bitter smell of coffee roasting for buyers who came early and stayed long. On the raised platform stood men and women who had crossed the ocean, chained in the hold of a ship. Some swayed where they stood. Promises stared at nothing. A few looked as if one more hard breath might fold them to the planks. At the end of that line stood Abeni. She was broad-shouldered, heavy through the hips, and worn down by hunger and the crossing. The marks on her ankles were still raw. Her dress hung wrong on her, crusted with old salt and travel dirt. And yet she did one thing the others around her barely had strength to do. She held herself upright, something harder than pride. She would not beg. She would not bow her head to earn softer mockery from cruel men. The auctioneer, Meliton Osuna, noticed the crowd's mood and leaned into it. "Who wants this one?" he called, slapping his little stick against his palm. "Too broad for the rose, too slow for the mill, strong enough perhaps to frighten chickens." That drew the laughter he wanted. One merchant from Orizaba climbed up to inspect her. He pressed her upper arm as if testing mule flesh, then pulled down her lip to look at her teeth. Abeni did not flinch. He stepped away, grinning. "I would not waste a candle stub on her," he said, loud enough for the whole square. There are insults that sting because they are false, and others because they are spoken by people who believe coin is the measure of a soul. Abeni had already lost too much to answer them. Somewhere behind those still eyes lived the memory of a river far from New Spain, of a mother's hand torn away in panic, and of a promise she had made to herself in the dark belly of a ship. They could strip her freedom, but they would not strip her memory. Then, from the back of the crowd, a man in widow's black spoke at last. 15 cents. If you value stories like this, subscribe now, because the next thing Don Baltasar Quintanar said over that bid made the whole plaza fall silent. The square did fall silent. Meliton Osuna blinked, half amused, half offended, as if the voice from the back had spoiled his performance. 15 cents, he repeated, rolling the words around for the crowd. Don Baltasar Quintanar, with that sum, you could barely buy the mat she'll sleep on. Baltasar did not smile. He stepped forward through the ring of traders, his black coat gathering dust at the hem, his face lean and tired under the noon glare. Widower's black in that heat looked almost stubborn. People in Jalapa knew him by sight. Sugar from San Telmo, good land in the Zongolica foothills, a man who had buried his wife and never quite returned from the grave with the rest of himself. That was what they whispered anyway. "It is what I offer," he said. The merchant from Orizaba gave a snort. "Then keep her, Baltasar. She will eat more than she earns." A few men laughed again, but less freely now. There was something in Baltasar's stillness that put a lid on easy cruelty. He climbed the platform himself. Up close, he could see what the crowd had chosen not to see. The swollen ankles, the rubbed skin at the wrists, the dryness at the corners of her mouth. Those eyes, simply watchful, as if she had already measured every man in that plaza and found them smaller than they believed themselves to be. Meliton spread his hands. "If no one wishes to improve the bid, she is yours." No one did. Not one planter, not one mule dealer, not one of the men fingering silver in their belts. For 15 cents, the laughing ended, the paper changed hands, and a human life was entered into a ledger. Then Baltasar did something stranger than the purchase. One of the drovers reached for Abeni's arm to pull her down from the platform. Baltasar caught the man's wrist before he touched her. His voice stayed low, but the whole front of the square heard it. "No hand shall touch her without my leave." The drover pulled back at once. Meliton gave an awkward chuckle, trying to smooth the moment. "As you wish, Don Baltasar. Your property, your rules." Property. The word hung there, ugly and ordinary. Abeni came down the steps on her own. Her legs trembled once, just once, and then steadied. Baltasar turned toward the ox cart waiting by the fountain. Beside it stood his steward, Isauro Membrillo, a thin man with a careful mustache, polished boots, and the narrow eyes of someone forever counting what belongs to others. He had watched the whole thing with open disbelief. "Master," Isauro said under his breath as Baltasar approached, "forgive me, but this purchase will set the town talking." "They already talk," Baltasar answered. "They will say grief has made you careless." At that, Baltasar looked back once at the platform, where another chained captive was being shoved into place for bidding. "Let them say what they like." Isauro's gaze shifted to Abeni as she climbed into the cart without help. He was not studying her body the way the buyers had. He was studying the danger of her, the danger of a choice he had not advised, of an order he had not given, of a boundary spoken in public that every servant on San Telmo would soon hear. When the cartwheels finally lurched over the stones and turned toward the mountain road, the steward rode beside them with a face as flat as paper, already wondering why a man who had stopped caring about almost everything had suddenly cared enough to protect this woman. The road out of Jalapa climbed slowly, and with every turn of the wheels, the noise of the market fell farther behind them. Abeni sat in the back of the cart with her hands folded tight in her lap, feeling each rut through the rough boards beneath her. Dust rose warm from the road, mules snorted, leather creaked. Once in a while the wind shifted, and she caught the scent of wet earth from the hills ahead. She said nothing. Neither did Baltasar for some time. He rode beside the cart instead of inside it, one gloved hand resting on the saddle horn, his dark coat drinking in the sun. Isauro spoke enough for both of them. "San Telmo is no place for softness," he said after a while, as if continuing an argument nobody else had started. "The cane does not bend for pity. The people work because they must, and the house runs because someone keeps order." Baltasar did not look at him. "Then keep it." The steward's mouth tightened. He had expected more. A defense, perhaps, an excuse, something he could measure and answer. But grief had made Baltasar sparing with words, and a silent master is harder to read than an angry one. Abeni listened without lifting her head. She understood more Spanish now than most people guessed, enough to hear contempt when it passed for advice, enough to know that the thin man riding near the wheel did not fear her weakness. He feared some change he could not yet name. As the road narrowed into greener country, memory returned the way pain returns when a fever breaks. Not all at once, but in flashes sharp enough to steal breath. A river wide as morning light, women rinsing calabashes near the bank, her mother's fingers separating roots on a woven mat, naming each one by touch before placing them in a basket. Then shouting, running feet, smoke where there should have been cooking fire only. Her own hand slipping from her mother's in the crush of bodies and fear. She closed her eyes for one heartbeat. In the ship's darkness, months before, she had made herself one promise. She would remember. Even if they stripped away her language in public, even if her old name was mocked, even if her life was entered in ledgers beside sacks of sugar and mule tack, she would remember what her mother had taught her hands. By late afternoon, the foothills of Zongalicho rose before them, blue-green and folded like cloth. San Telmo came into view little by little. First the cane fields, whispering in long rows. Then the whitewashed chapel bell tower. Then the main house, broad and pale under red tile, with worker huts lower down the slope, and a smoke-dark kitchen wing at the rear. People had already seen the cart. A stable boy stopped carrying fodder. 2 washerwomen turned from the line with wet hands. A pair of field hands came up from the mill path. Standing in the kitchen doorway, arms dusted with flour to the elbow, was a hard-faced woman in a faded apron, staring straight at Abeni, as though the estate had just been sent to plague instead of a servant. When the cart rolled into the yard, that woman did not curtsy to Baltasar first. She looked at Isaro and said in a voice meant to carry, "Tell me that is not what he brought home." For one breath, the whole yard seemed to stop with that question hanging in the evening air. The woman in the doorway was Jacinta, the head cook, and she had the look of someone who had spent years ruling fire, knives, and servants with the same hard hand. Flour clung to her forearms. Steam from the kitchen drifted around her, carrying the smell of boiled beans, singed lard, and onion. Her eyes moved over Abeni with open offense, then flicked toward Baltasar as if daring him to deny what everyone could plainly see. Baltasar dismounted without haste. "It is what I brought home," he said. Jacinta pressed her lips thin. "Then the kitchen will need another pot, because that one will eat for 3. A few workers lowered their heads to hide their faces. Isaro did not. He let the insult stand there like a fence post, useful because someone else had planted it. Abeni climbed carefully down from the cart. The packed earth felt strange under her bare feet after so many days of jolting wood. Her knees trembled, though she refused to show it in her face. Then Baltasar turned, and his voice carried farther than it had in Jalapa. "She will be lodged beside the bake room until I say otherwise. She will be given water, soap, and decent clothes. And hear me well. No hand shall touch her without my leave." This time there was no laugh at all. The stable boy looked at the ground. One of the washerwomen crossed herself out of habit, though whether from pity or fear, even she could not have said. Jacinta's chin lifted a little. She had served too long under masters to challenge an order in the open. "As you wish, Don Baltasar," she said. But the respect in her voice was only for the title. Isaro stepped in smoothly, almost helpfully. "I'll see it done." Baltasar gave him a short look. "See that you do." The main house stood quiet behind them, shutters half closed against the falling sun. No laughter came from within, no wife's voice, no child running through the arcade. The place held that peculiar stillness some houses take on after grief has settled in for too long. Even Abeni, new as she was, could feel it. Men could mourn with candles and black cloth. Houses mourned by going dim. Jacinta led the way toward the kitchen wing with a ring of keys striking her hip. The passage smelled of old smoke and wet stone. A low room waited off to one side, no bigger than a storage cell, with a straw pallet, a cracked basin, and one narrow window where the last light lay in a dusty stripe. "There," she said. "You rise before first bell. You grind, carry, scrub, and keep out of everyone's way. If you are clever, you will speak little." Abeni set one hand on the doorframe, feeling the rough wood under her palm. Jacinta looked back once more, this time with less mockery and more calculation. "What did he see in you?" Abeni did not answer. She had learned that silence was sometimes the last clean thing a person owned. But out in the yard, while the mules were being unharnessed and the sky deepened over San Telmo, Isauro Membrillo had already turned toward the office where the estate ledgers were kept, and toward the first quiet idea of how this new woman might have to be broken. The next days at San Telmo taught Abeni the shape of her new life before anyone bothered to teach her kindness. The first bell dragged her up in darkness, when the kitchen floor was still cold through the soles of her feet, and the ash in the stove gave off that dry, bitter smell of yesterday's fire. Jacinta put work into her hands the way other people put stones into a sack. Grind the maize, carry water from the cistern, scrape the black soot from the copper pots, kneel and scour the red stone floor until it lost its grease shine. By noon, her shoulders burned. By evening, her palms were ridged and sore. Still, the work kept coming. A basket of cassava to peel, a heap of onions that stung the eyes, lard buckets to lift, wood to stack, wash water to throw out behind the kitchen wall where flies already buzzed in the heat. Yet the mockery from Jalapa began to crack against plain fact. The body they had laughed at did not fold. She moved slowly at first, yes, because ship weakness and road dust were still in her bones. But once her strength began returning, she could lift what smaller women asked two people to carry. She hauled brimming jars without slopping half their contents away. She fed the grinding stone with a steady rhythm that made the kitchen girls glance up in surprise. One of them, a freckled scullery girl called Elenita, whispered one afternoon, "I thought you would faint the first morning." Jacinta heard that and snapped, "Then stop thinking and peel." That was her manner every day. If Abeni salted too soon, Jacinta clicked her tongue. If she moved too near the stove, Jacinta shoved a spoon into her hand and sent her back to the wash bench. If anyone praised her strength, the cook found some fault to hang around her neck before sunset. The others watched and learned their measure from that. Not cruelty and open blows, Baltasar's warning had settled that, but contempt has many small tools, and old servants know how to use them. Baltasar himself passed through those days like a man still living in a room inside his own grief. At supper hour he crossed the arcade in black, ate little, spoke less, and disappeared into the main house before the workers' lamps were lit. Once, Abeni looked up from the trough where she was rinsing greens and found him standing in the courtyard, staring at nothing, one hand resting against a pillar as though the stone were the only thing keeping him upright. Then Isauro approached with account papers, and the moment closed. A week later, near dusk, the yard erupted in a shout. A cane hand came stumbling from the mill path, clutching one hand to his chest, blood running down his wrist and dripping dark into the dust. The smell of iron hit the air before he reached the kitchen door. Jacinta swore. Elenita screamed. Someone yelled for a rag, someone else for the steward. Abeni looked once at the wound, then at the filthy cloth a boy tried to press into it, and stepped forward. She moved before anyone gave her leave. The injured man had sliced the base of his palm, deep and ugly, the kind of cut that fills fast and then turns foul if nobody cleans it properly. Blood ran between his fingers and down his forearm in warm, shining threads. He was a young field hand named Toribio, though in that moment he looked more like a frightened boy than a grown worker. He swayed once. The rag someone tried to jam against the wound was black with old grease. "Not that," Abeni said. Her voice stopped them almost as much as the blood had. It was the first firm order most of them had heard from her. Jacinta stared as Abeni took the cloth away, reached for a clean strip of kitchen linen from the drying line and said, "Hot water, aloe, and the pale bark from the woodpile shelf." Jacinta's eyebrows jumped. "You think you're the surgeon now?" "I think dirt will rot his hand." There was no time to argue. Even Jacinta knew that. Elenita ran for water. Another girl brought the aloe leaves from the back wall where they grew in cracked pots. Abeni knelt on the warm, packed earth, pressed the fresh cloth hard enough to slow the bleeding, then rinsed the wound with water so hot that steam rose from the man's skin. Toribio sucked air through his teeth and tried to pull back. "Hold still," she told him. "If you want to keep your fingers, hold still." He did. From the shelf she took the bark the house used sometimes for stomach trouble, scraped it, crushed it with the flat of a knife handle, and mixed it with ash from the clean side of the stove and a little rendered grease. The paste smelled sharp, smoky, and green at once. She split the aloe, laid the cool flesh against the torn skin, packed the paste around the cut, and wrapped it tight with the linen. The whole yard had gone quiet by then. Even Isauro had stepped closer. "What foolishness is this?" he asked, folding his arms. Abeni did not look up. "Tomorrow he opens the hand only enough to wash it, then bind it again. No cane cutting for 3 days. Toribio let out a breath that was half pain, half relief. Jacinta gave a short, doubtful click of the tongue. "And if fever comes?" Abeni rose slowly, wiping her bloody hands on the edge of her apron. "If fever comes, then you may laugh at me." That night the kitchen hummed with talk long after the last pot was stacked. Some called it village trickery. Some said desperate people trust anything that sounds certain. Isaro made sure both thoughts kept walking from mouth to mouth. But on the second day the wound stayed clean. On the third, Toribio flexed his fingers and found no swelling, no heat, no sour smell of corruption. By afternoon, that news had climbed the hill faster than any servant. Just before supper, while Abeni was scraping maize from the grinding stone, a shadow fell across the kitchen threshold. When she looked up, Don Baltasar was standing there, watching her hands. He stayed there long enough for everyone in the kitchen to pretend not to look. The evening light reached only halfway across the floor, leaving Baltasar in a stripe of gold and shadow. Behind him, the courtyard carried its usual sounds: buckets set down, a mule stamping, the far clack of the mill. Inside, all that could be heard was the slow scrape of maize against stone, and the soft hiss from a pot left simmering too low. Abeni rose at once, wiping her hands. "Sit," he said. It was such an ordinary word, but in that house it had the force of surprise. Jacinta froze with a ladle in her hand. Even Elenita stopped breathing for a moment. Abeni looked from the master to the bench and then obeyed, settling carefully on the edge, as if the permission itself might be taken back. Baltasar stepped nearer. He did not loom over her the way the buyers in Jalapa had done. His eyes dropped to her hands first, to the small cuts across the knuckles from kitchen work, to the green stain of aloe still caught at one fingernail. "Toribio's hand," he said. "I saw it." Abeni lowered her gaze. "If I did wrong, I ask pardon." "You did not do wrong." The words landed with more force than anyone expected. Jacinta looked down into her pot. Isauro, who had appeared soundlessly at the outer door, remained very still. Baltasar asked, "Who taught you?" Abeni hesitated. She could smell masa warming on the griddle, wood smoke caught in the rafters, old rain in the stone walls. The room felt suddenly narrow. "My mother," she said at last. "She knew healing roots and herb room work, leaves, bark, fever water, things for swelling, things for bad blood in a wound." "Here?" Jacinta muttered before she could stop herself. "In these hills?" "In my home first," Abeni answered quietly. "Elsewhere, before this place." Baltasar took that in without pressing further. He was not a man who asked questions for sport. When he spoke again, his voice had gone softer, almost tired. "The town barber-surgeon has treated my workers for years. Half his cures smell of vinegar and pride. Yet you clean one hand, and by the third day it closes without fever." Isaro let out a thin breath through his nose. "Luck visits fools sometimes, master." Baltasar turned his head just enough to show he had heard. "Then let us hope luck remains." It was a small rebuke, spoken without heat, and that made it sting more. Isauro bowed slightly, but the muscle in his jaw moved once. Before leaving, Baltasar glanced again at Abeni. "If there is another such injury, you are to be called." Jacinta looked up sharply. "From the kitchen?" "From wherever she is." Then he was gone, his boots retreating across the courtyard stones toward the main house. The kitchen stayed silent a moment longer, as though his words still occupied the room after he had left it. Jacinta was first to recover. "Back to work," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Abeni returned to the grinding stone, but she could feel the weight of several new glances now. Curious ones. Wary ones. From the doorway, Isaro gave her a look she had not seen before. The look of a man who had just realized that 15 cents might cost him much more than silver. After that evening, the kitchen did not become kinder, but it did become quieter when Abeni spoke. Word travels fast on an estate, faster than carts, faster than orders, faster even than truth sometimes. Within days, the women at the washstones were repeating how Toribio had kept all his fingers. The mule boys added their own flourishes. By the end of the week, one said she could close any wound with leaves alone. Another swore she had learned her craft from forest spirits. Abeni heard both versions and answered neither. She kept grinding, hauling, scrubbing. But now, when someone burned a hand on a pothook or turned an ankle on the slope, eyes drifted toward her before they drifted toward Hacienda. Then the rains came. They came first as afternoon muttering in the hills, then as full drumming on tile roofs, on cane leaves, on the packed paths between the workers' huts. Water gathered in ruts, damp crept into blankets, into straw pallets, into children's chests. At night, the labor quarter changed its sound. Instead of quiet talk and tired laughter, there came the dry, barking cough of little ones who could not clear their throats, followed by the low murmur of mothers trying to soothe them. The town doctor arrived twice that month, riding a narrow mare with his black case bouncing against the saddle. He smelled of vinegar, old wool, and impatience. He looked into mouths, pressed cold fingers to thin wrists, and left behind powders, bleedings, and instructions that cost more than most families could spare. A child might cough less for an hour, and then worse by midnight. A mother would watch the candle burn down and wonder whether the cure had strength in it or only price. One evening, as Hacienda was skimming broth, a woman from the huts came to the back step carrying a little girl wrapped in a shawl. The child's cheeks were red with heat, each breath caught high and sharp. "Please," the mother whispered, not even sure to whom she was speaking. "Somebody help her." Hacienda looked toward the yard, hoping for the doctor, hoping for Isauro, hoping for anybody whose authority might spare her the choice. Neither man was there. Abeni set down the basket she was sorting. She touched the child's neck, then listened close to her breathing. "Boil water," she said. "Bring the eucalyptus leaves hanging by the rafters, and honey, the dark one, from the clay jar." Hacienda frowned. "You mean to treat coughing with tea? With steam first, then with the honey." The mother looked from one woman to the other, trembling. "Will it help?" "It may help enough for her to sleep." That was no miracle promise. It was steadier than that, and somehow more convincing. Before midnight, the little girl was sitting propped against her mother's chest, breathing easier through the damp warmth Abeni had made her inhale. The next morning, another mother came, then another. By the third night, the back kitchen had become a line of worried women holding fever-warm children under shawls that smelled of smoke and wet wool. At the far end of that line, arms crossed, jaw set like stone, stood one old cane cutter who did not move aside when Abeni approached. His name was Refugio Cañedo, and he said, "My grandson will take nothing from your hands." Abeni did not step back when Refugio Cañedo said it. The old cane cutter stood in the kitchen glow with rain darkening his hat brim, and his grandson wrapped against his chest in a striped blanket. His beard was white at the chin, his shoulders bowed from years in the fields, but pride still held his spine in place. The child on his hip wheezed softly, face hot and damp, one little fist opening and closing against the blanket edge. Behind the Refugio, two mothers in line lowered their eyes. They knew that kind of stubbornness. In hard places, pride is often the last blanket a person owns. Abeni answered him quietly. "Then keep him close tonight. Sit him up when he sleeps. If his breath grows tighter, boil water and let him breathe the steam." Refugio's mouth hardened. "My family has lived through cough seasons before you came here." Hacienda, who only days earlier would have welcomed the quarrel, surprised herself by saying, "Then why are you standing at my door, old man?" He flushed under the lantern light, muttered something that sounded like a curse, and turned away. The wet hem of his shirt slapped against his legs as he crossed the yard. The child coughed twice on the way back to the huts. Abeni watched them go, then returned to the line of waiting mothers. She never once called him back. The rain kept on through the night, steady as fingers drumming a table. Water slipped from roof edges into the yard. Somewhere a mule shifted in the stable. Abeni slept little. By the time the sky had only just begun to pale behind the chapel tower, a fist struck her door so hard the wood jumped in its frame. When she opened it, Refugio was there again. This time he was bareheaded. His hair clung damply to his temples, and the old pride had gone out of his face. In his arms, the boy burned with fever. Each breath whistled and caught, as if a knot had been tied inside his chest. "Help him," Refugio said, and the words came rough, almost torn from him. "If you can, help him." She did not waste a heartbeat on triumph. "Inside," she said. The room smelled of damp straw, smoke, and the sharp green of the leaves she had been drying near the wall. She fed coals into the brazier, set water to heat, crushed eucalyptus between her palms until the oil rose strong and clean, and stirred in wild honey so dark it looked almost brown-black in the spoon. Refugio stood near the door, clutching and unclutching his hat, while Abeni propped the child upright with rolled blankets and let the warm steam loosen what panic could not. "Not too fast," she told him as the boy struggled. "Little breaths. Let him follow the warmth." The old man obeyed every instruction now. Hold him higher, wipe his face, wet the cloth again. When the fever climbed, she cooled the child's wrists and neck. When the cough locked his chest, she waited through it with a steadiness that made the room itself seem calmer. By dawn, the breathing had changed. Still rough, still tired, but deeper. The boy slept at last against his grandfather's shoulder, sweat cooling at his temples. But Refugio stared down at him for a long moment. Then he looked up at Abeni, with eyes gone red from fear and wakefulness. He opened his mouth as if apology ought to come easily to a man of his years. Before he could speak, another voice sounded from the doorway behind him. "So," said the Sauro Membrio, "this is where the estate's sick have begun to gather." Isauro did not raise his voice, but somehow the room felt colder when he stepped in. The steward stood with rain still shining on his boots, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe as if he had wandered there by accident. Yet nothing about him was accidental. His gaze moved from the sleeping child to the steaming bowl, to the crushed leaves on the table, and finally to Abeni. Refugio straightened at once, almost guilty, though the guilt was only fear wearing another coat. "My grandson was failing," the old man said before anyone asked. "She helped him breathe." Isauro gave a thin smile. "So I see. San Telmo seems to have gained its own healer overnight." Abeni wiped her hands on a cloth and answered without heat. "The boy needed warmth and clear air. Of course." He stepped farther in, taking in the small room with its basin, pallet, and bundles of drying leaves tied with twine. "And soon, perhaps, every cough and cut on the estate will find its way here. Very convenient." Refugio's jaw tightened. In the yard, he might have swallowed that tone. With the child asleep against him, he did not. Convenient or not, he breathes easier than he did. For one brief second, surprise crossed Isauro's face. He had not expected the old cutter to speak up. Then it was gone. "Take the boy home," he said. "And next time, notify the house first." Refugio hesitated, looked at Abeni, then nodded and left with the child wrapped close. The door shut behind him. Rain tapped at the shutter. Steam still curled from the bowl between them. When they were alone, Isauro lowered his voice. "You should remember your place." Abeni held his gaze just long enough to show she had heard, then looked down again. "My place was where the sick child was." That answer pricked him. He did not flare. Men like Isauro rarely do when anger can be sharpened and saved. "A few workers praise you, and already you speak like someone with standing. I spoke because you asked." He stared at her a moment longer, then turned and went without another word. But before dawn had fully lifted, the matter had reached Baltasar. The master sent for Abeni after the morning bell. She followed a housemaid through the side corridor of the main residence, her bare feet silent on cool tile, the air carrying wax, damp linen, and the faint sweetness of orange peel kept in bowls against mustiness. She had only crossed that threshold once before, on the evening she arrived, and then only as a burden being placed. Now she was being summoned. Baltasar waited in a long room open to the courtyard, a ledger on the table beside him, unread. He looked as though he had slept little. "Refugio's grandson?" he asked. "Better by morning." He nodded, then glanced toward the rain-dark garden beyond the arch. "I've been told my kitchen has become a gathering place for the sick." Abeni stood very still. "They came because the children were coughing." "And because the town doctor leaves them weaker than he found them?" She did not answer that. She did not need to. Baltasar rested his fingers on the back of a chair, thinking. The room beside the bakehouse is too cramped for what is happening. There is an old store chamber near the rear wall, and the strip of earth beside it that gets half a day of sun. He looked up at her then, with that grave, inward expression that never quite left his face. "Can you tell me what would grow there?" Abeni looked past him toward the strip of ground where rain had darkened the soil into almost black bands beneath the wall. "Yes," she said after a moment. "If the water runs off and does not sit there too long. Rue would hold. Mint, if it is watched. Epazote. Maybe other things, if the earth is turned deep." Baltasar listened the way a tired man listens when something useful enters a house that has lacked it for years. He did not interrupt. "Then the room is yours," he said. "Not for idleness, for work that serves this estate. Jacinta will release the key." Abeni lowered her head. "Thank you." When she was gone, Isaro found him still standing under the archway. "Master, forgive me, but this is unwise," the steward said. "The workers already talk." A woman with leaves and whispers becomes larger in their minds than she ought. Baltasar's answer was mild enough to sound dangerous. "If they are talking because their children breathe easier, I can endure it." By that afternoon, Jacinta, grumbling the whole way, unlocked the old store chamber. The door stuck before it opened. A breath of stale air came out first, carrying dust, damp wood, mouse droppings, and the faint, bitter smell of old onions once kept there. Sun found its way through one cracked shutter. The room held a broken stool, 3 empty baskets, and a wall shelf bowed with age. "It is hardly a palace," Jacinta muttered. "It is enough," Abeni said. That answer irked the cook more than complaint would have. She thrust the key into Abeni's hand and left. Yet by evening she sent Elenita with a spare clay jar, then later with a bundle of old cloth strips that might as well be used. Kindness at San Telmo rarely arrived dressed as kindness. The little patch beside the chamber took 2 days to clear. The soil was clotted with stones and roots, and the work left Abeni's back aching. A stableman passing with a feed sack paused to watch her. He was an elderly African called Severino by the house, though the workers sometimes called him Father out of habit and affection. One eye was milkier than the other. His hands, though bent with age, still knew labor. "You turn that earth like someone who expects it to answer," he said. Abeni rested on the hoe handle. "Sometimes it does." A ghost of a smile touched his face. He crouched, rubbed the soil between finger and thumb, and named the local plants that liked that kind of ground, one after another. Some she knew by smell, some by leaf, some not at all. By the time the light began to fade, he had shown her where to find wild rue near the wall, mint runners by the laundry trough, and the bitter weed the women here used for stomach worms. Then came the seeds. Abeni sat alone on the threshold that night with a needle in one hand and the torn hem of the same travel-worn skirt in the other. She unpicked the hidden fold slowly, almost reverently. From the seam dropped a few tiny, hard seeds into her palm. okra seeds she had carried through salt air, darkness, hunger, and mockery, because they were the last living thing from home she had managed to keep. The next morning, she pressed them into the wet earth beside the chamber. From the gallery above, unseen by her, Isaro watched the whole thing. He watched Baltasar cross the yard later and stop to ask one quiet question about the planting. He watched the answer hold the master there longer than any kitchen servant had a right to hold him. When he turned away from that sight, he was no longer merely annoyed. He was afraid. Fear, in a place like San Telmo, did not always shout. Sometimes it put on clean boots, folded its hands, and waited for help from family. A week after the planting, a carriage came up the slope from the Orizaba road, wheels hissing through damp mud, harness bells giving off a neat silver jingle that sounded almost too fine for the workyard. The servants knew that sound. Jacinta wiped her hands on her apron and muttered, "His sister." Even Isaro straightened his coat. Doña Micaela de Armenta arrived with a travel cape, a stiff spine, and the kind of careful gaze that could find disorder in a room before she had crossed its threshold. She was Baltasar's elder sister, widowed herself, devout, disciplined, and very certain that every soul ought to remain in the place God and custom had assigned it. She embraced her brother in the courtyard, held him at arm's length to study his face, then at once began noticing what had changed at San Telmo without her permission to notice it. By supper, she had already seen mothers lingering near the rear wall, the old store chambers swept clean, and a row of drying leaves tied under the eaves. She said nothing then, but silence from a woman like Michaela was only a lid, never an absence. That evening, beneath the soft light of 2 wax candles, she sat across from Baltasar in the small dining room where the air smelled faintly of stew, beeswax, and old cedar. "The staff speaks of a woman in the yard," she said, cutting her bread with tidy precision. "A woman you bought for 15 cents and now allowed to keep plants behind the house." Baltasar drank water before answering. "She has been useful." "Useful is one thing. Favored is another." He set the cup down. "If you came to inspect my grief, sister, you are late. If you came to inspect my management, say so plainly." Michaela's face did not soften, though something tired flickered in her eyes. "I came because the town repeats what it hears. A household in mourning should guard itself from foolish talk." At that very hour, Abeni was in the small chambers sorting stems by lamplight when she heard skirts brush the doorway. She rose at once. Michaela stood there with gloved hands clasped, taking in the shelf, the jars, the sharp scent of mint and rue, the sweep of the floor, the order of it all. "So," the lady said at last, "this is the room that has my brother's attention." Abeni kept her eyes lowered, but not so low that she seemed broken. "It is the room he gave for the sick." Michaela stepped inside 1 pace, no more. "And what do you seek in return?" The question hung between them with all its hidden meanings. Advancement, influence, a softer bed, a place in the house beyond the one the world had assigned her. Abeni could hear every one of them. She answered simply, "A place where a child may breathe easier, and a wound may close clean." Michaela watched her for a long moment. Outside, rainwater dripped from the tiled roof into the yard cistern. Somewhere in the stable, a horse stamped once. The older woman's gaze fell then to the fresh-turned patch beyond the threshold, where the smallest green points had begun to break the soil. She turned back toward Abeni. "My brother has a tender conscience when grief is stirred. Tender consciences are easily misled." Before Abeni could reply, another voice came from the courtyard arch. "He is many things," Baltasar said, having arrived unheard, "but easily misled has never been one of them." Michaela said nothing more in the herb room that evening, but silence from her had edges. She stayed 3 days at San Telmo, and in those 3 days she watched everything. She watched mothers nod to Abeni from the yard. She watched Jacinta send scraps of linen to the little chamber without being asked twice. She watched Baltasar pause beside the fresh beds of mint and rue, as if the sight of green life pushing through wet earth had become, for him, a kind of prayer. None of that pleased her, yet she was too disciplined to quarrel over every offense at once. On the morning she departed, fog lay low along the cane rows and the mules snorted steam into the chill. At the carriage step, Michaela kissed her brother's cheek and said very softly, "A household is weakened first by disorder, then by talk, and finally by scandal. Guard yourself from all three." Baltasar answered with equal calm, "I will guard this house as I see fit." She left with that, but not before turning once to look back toward the rear wall, where Abeni was bending over the small patch of earth, hands dark with soil. That look stayed with the servants long after the carriage bells faded. Isauro, more than any of them, understood what it meant. If a lady like Michaela began to doubt what was proper, then the boundaries in this house were shifting in ways that might one day reach his ledgers. The rains deepened through the following weeks. Water gathered at the base of the mill path. Frogs began calling at dusk from the ditches. The cough among the children slowly eased, and for a few days San Telmo breathed easier. Abeni dried more leaves in the chamber, labeled jars in her own quiet way, and learned from old Severino which hillside bark turned bitterness into medicine and which turned it into poison. Then the new fever came. It did not begin in the labor huts this time. It began in the main house. First, one of the seamstresses took to her bed with heat in her face and pain behind the eyes. Then a pantry boy staggered while carrying plates and had to be led away. By the second day, even Jacinta's hands shook as she stirred broth, because word had reached the kitchen that young Nicolas, Baltasar's only son, still small enough to leave toy soldiers under chairs, had woken, burning and half delirious. The town doctor arrived before noon on a mud-splashed mare, his case banging against the saddle. He went upstairs smelling of vinegar and damp wool. For hours, servants ran up and down the stairs with basins, cloths, and hot water. Once, Abeni saw a bowl come back pink with blood from one of his treatments. Jacinta crossed herself at the sight. By dusk, the whole house had gone unnaturally quiet. No one slammed doors. No one laughed in the yard. Even the mill seemed to turn more softly under the rain. Baltasar remained upstairs, and when Isauro carried a message up, he came down pale and tight-lipped. "How is the boy?" Jacinta whispered. Isauro snapped, "Do your work." But servants listen with their skin in such moments. They knew. Night fell. Lamps were lit one by one along the corridor. Abeni was in the herb room, stripping wilted leaves from a stem, when hurried footsteps splashed across the yard. It was Elenita, breathless, apron soaked at the hem. She stopped in the doorway, eyes wide. "Abeni," she said, "the doctor says we must prepare for the worst, and Don Baltasar is asking for you." Abeni did not run at once. She took what she would need. From the shelf she gathered willow bark, a bundle of dried bitter leaves old Severino had shown her, a clay cup, clean cloths, and a small gourd of honeyed water. Her hands moved quickly, but never wildly. Outside, Elenita shifted from foot to foot in the rain-dark doorway, twisting her apron. "Hurry," the girl whispered. "Don Baltasar has not left the boy's side." "I am hurrying," Abeni said. They crossed the courtyard under a low sky that pressed the whole house down with it. Rain had eased to a fine mist, but the stones were slick, and the air smelled of wet lime, lamp smoke, and the sour trace of sickness that seems to spread through walls before any doctor names it. Upstairs, the hallway was dim. A maid passed, carrying a basin, eyes red from crying. At the end of the corridor, the bedchamber door stood open. The town doctor was there, sleeves turned back, his mouth set in tired annoyance. On a table beside him sat stained cloths, a bowl clouded with pink water, and his black case left half open like a mouth that had run out of answers. Nicolas lay tangled in damp sheets, cheeks burning, lips dry, his breath uneven and shallow. Baltasar sat beside the bed, one hand on the mattress near the child's arm, as if touching the boy directly might break whatever thin hold on life remained. When he saw Abeni, he rose so abruptly the chair legs scraped the floor. "Help him," he said, and in those 2 words there was no title, no distance, no estate custom, only a father. The doctor drew himself up. This is madness. The boy requires discipline in treatment, not kitchen guessing. Abeni's eyes stayed on the child. He requires cooling, water, and time enough to breathe. The physician gave a hard little laugh. And herbs, I suppose. Baltasar turned on him then, not loudly, but with a force that made even the maids still themselves. You have bled him, purged him, and prayed over him. His fever climbs. If you have more to offer, speak it now. If not, stand aside. The doctor's face went mottled. For a moment it seemed he might argue. Then pride, finding no purchase, curdled into silence. He stepped back. Abeni set down her things and went to the bed. She touched the boy's forehead, then his neck, then the inside of his wrist. His skin was burning, but his hands were cold. She lifted one eyelid, watched the unfocused movement there, and listened to the catch in his chest. "How long since he kept water down?" she asked. "Since yesterday," Baltasar said. She nodded once. "Then no more bleeding, no heavy broth, only small sips, often. Fresh water boiled first. Cloths changed before they warm." Hacienda, who had followed them halfway up and stood now in the doorway clutching her apron, swallowed hard. "Can it be turned?" Abeni did not offer false comfort. "If his strength has not gone too far." She sent Alenita for more hot water, another maid for extra linens, Hacienda for a wide bowl, and asked that the shutters be opened a finger's width for cleaner air. Then she began to work, not with grand gestures, but with the patient, relentless steadiness of someone who knew that fever was beaten minute by minute, not by speeches. Baltasar remained beside her through it all, watching every motion, as if one mistake might cost him his child. By the time the first bitter brew was ready, the doctor had not left the room. He was standing in the corner, arms folded, eyes narrowed, waiting for her to fail. The first hours passed in a kind of hard silence, broken only by water, breath, and waiting. Abeni worked beside the bed, as if the whole room had narrowed to the child's skin, pulse, and breathing. She cooled the cloths and changed them before they lost their chill. She lifted Nicolas enough to let the tightness in his chest ease a little. When he could swallow, she tipped a few drops of bitter water between his lips and waited, counting in her head before offering more. Too much would come back up, too little would do nothing. The doctor watched from the corner with offended stillness, while Hacienda moved in and out, carrying basins, fresh linens, and whatever else Abeni named. By midnight, the candles had burned low, and the room smelled of wax, wet cloth, fever sweat, and the sharp bitterness of the bark steeping in the cup. Baltasar had not changed his coat. He had not sat for more than a few breaths at a time. Once Nicolas began to mutter in a dream, reaching weakly with one hand toward the air, and Baltasar caught those fingers so quickly it seemed he had been waiting for nothing else. "Is he worse?" he asked. Abeni laid the back of her hand against the boy's throat. "He's still burning, but he is fighting." The doctor gave a low sound that might have been a scoff. "Children often thrash before they fail." Baltasar turned his head slowly. In the softened candlelight, his face looked older than it had in the courtyard, worn almost to the bone. "Then keep that thought to yourself." After that, the doctor said nothing. Toward the deepest part of the night, Nicolas's breathing changed again. It quickened, then caught, then quickened once more. Hacienda, standing by the washstand, pressed both hands to her mouth. Even Abeni felt a chill move through her, though the room was hot enough to sting the eyes. She shifted the boy higher, loosened the cloth at his throat, rubbed warmth into his cold fingers, and changed the brew slightly. Less bark, more water, a touch of honey to get it down. "Come on," she murmured, not to the room, not to the father, only to the child. "Stay here." Baltasar heard it anyway. He sank to one knee beside the bed and bowed his head for the first time all night. No grand prayer came out, no fine scripture, just a man breathing through fear, one hand covering his mouth while the other stayed on his son's blanket. Outside, rain began again, tapping softly at the shutters. Then, very slowly, the boy's breath loosened. Not much, not enough for anyone to rejoice, but enough that Jacinta lowered her hands, and enough that Abeni asked for fresh water instead of more cloths. She tipped another swallow between Nicolas's lips. This time, he kept it. The doctor pushed away from the wall at last. He came forward, put his fingers to the child's wrist, and frowned, as if insulted by what he felt there. "A change," he said reluctantly. "Yes," Abeni answered. For the first time since she entered the chamber, he looked at her as though she were a problem he had misjudged. Dawn came gray and thin through the shutters. The fever had not broken, but it no longer climbed, like a fire finding dry wood. Baltasar stood beside the window, exhausted beyond speech, when a servant hurried into the corridor below calling for Isaro. A few moments later, the steward appeared at the door, face set, hat still in his hand. "Master," he said, and even before the next words came, something in his tone changed the air in the room. "3 more children from the labor huts have taken the same fever, and one of them is Jacinta's son." For a moment, nobody in that room seemed to know which life to fear for first. Jacinta went white. The basin in her hands tipped, and cold water sloshed over her skirt without her seeming to feel it. "My boy?" she whispered. Isaro gave a short nod. "He collapsed before dawn. The others are burning too." The doctor lifted his chin at once, eager now that disaster had widened enough to make his failure look less personal. "You see? Contagion through the lower quarters. The household must be sealed from it. No more traffic between these rooms and the huts." Abeni looked up sharply. "If the same fever is there, they need water, shade, and cooling now. They need discipline," the doctor snapped, "and distance." Baltasar turned from the bed. He had been awake too long, frightened too long, yet his voice came clear. "Nicolas remains first, but no child on this estate will be left to cook in his own skin while men argue." That struck Jacinta harder than any order he had given before. For years she had served his house, guarded his table, carried his grief quietly around him. Yet in that instant what broke her was not the master's authority, but the plain fact that he had named her son among the children worth saving. She set down the basin with trembling hands and looked at Abeni. Pride, suspicion, old kitchen cruelties, all of them stood there between the two women for one heartbeat. Then Jacinta swallowed and said the words she had never imagined saying. "Tell me what to do." Abeni answered at once. "Fresh water boiled, cloths in every room. Keep the sick sitting up when they can bear it. No heavy food. If they vomit, smaller sips again and again. Cool the wrists, the neck, the forehead. And send someone to my chamber for the rest of the bark." The doctor made a sound of disgust. "You would run an estate on peasant broth and leaves." Baltasar's eyes moved to him with a kind of exhausted contempt. "If your methods had turned the fever, doctor, I would gladly be following them." The man flushed and stepped back. What followed was not graceful. It was frantic, wet-footed, sleepless work. Servants became runners, the upstairs corridor filled with the smell of boiled water and wilted cloth. In the yard below, Severino and Refugio carried buckets from the cistern while Elenita and 2 laundry girls tore old linens into strips. Jacinta herself took a basket, crossed the mud to the labor huts, and knelt by her own son, with the same hands that had spent years commanding kitchens. Everywhere, one instruction traveled ahead of the people carrying it: do what Abeni says. By late afternoon, Nicolas's fever had dipped a little more. Not enough for comfort, but enough for hope to stop feeling like a sin. In the workers' quarter, Jacinta's boy had begun swallowing water again. Another child's breathing eased. Refugio shouted for more cooled cloths. The estate had become a house of damp sheets, murmured prayers, and running feet. Isauro watched all of it from beneath the arcade, hands clasped behind his back. He watched mothers thank Abeni before they thanked the saints. He watched Jacinta obey her without argument. He watched Baltasar cross the yard once, just once, to ask in a low voice whether more bark was needed from the hills. Standing there with the ledgers of San Telmo in his office and fear in his stomach, he understood something that made his mouth go dry. If this woman kept saving lives, people would start trusting her more than they feared him. That night, while the last light drained from the sky and the fever rooms glowed one by one behind shutter cracks, Isauro unlocked his office, pulled out a small purse of silver, and sent for 2 field hands who owed him more than money. Those 2 men came to Isauro after dark by the side door of the office, hats in hand, boots muddy from the lower fields. One was called Benito Sosa, broad-backed and nervous, with a wife expecting another child before the next harvest. The other, Lázaro Vides, had a bad debt from a lost mule and the look of a man forever choosing the wrong master to fear. Isauro let them stand while he counted coins onto the desk one by one. The little silver pieces clicked softly in the lamplight, and that sound carried more power in San Telmo than many sermons. "You both owe the estate," he said. "I can make a debt lighter or heavier." Neither man answered. He slid the coins forward with one finger. "Soon people may ask what they have seen near the rear chamber. Who goes in at odd hours? What hangs over the door? What words are spoken there?" Benito swallowed. "We have seen nothing, Don Isauro." "You will." The room smelled of lamp oil, damp paper, and old ink. Behind Isauro, the shelves of ledgers stood like silent witnesses, though they had kept his secrets well enough for years. He opened a drawer and set out a twisted cord knotted with reeds, a little wax packet darkened with soot, and a folded holy card marked over with charcoal lines. None of it looked grand. That was the cleverness of it. Superstition rarely wears jewels. It wears scraps, mutters, and things half glimpsed before dawn. Lázaro stared at the objects, then at the steward. "You want us to say she made these?" "I want you to say what decent Christian men would fear to find near a place where sickness gathers." Benito took one step back. "If the master asks." "The master will hear what the church hears," Isauro cut in. "And the church hears what honest men report." He let that settle, then added in a softer voice, "Or would you rather I review every sack you 2 have ever shorted from the cane line?" That was the end of their courage. Benito snatched up the coins first. Lázaro followed more slowly, but he followed. While they bent their heads over silver, the fever rooms still glowed in the house. Above them, Abeni had not left Nicolas except to wash her hands and fetch fresh cloths. By dawn of the 2nd day, the boy opened his eyes properly for the first time and asked for water in a cracked little voice. Baltasar sat down then as though his bones had finally remembered they were human. He covered his face with one hand and wept without sound. News of that recovery spread through San Telmo before the noon meal. Mothers crossed themselves. Refugio said aloud that the woman in the herb room had dragged one more child back from the ditch. Jacinta, who had spent the night moving between her son and the master's household, no longer corrected anyone who praised Abeni. She only worked faster. That, more than the child's fever itself, hardened Isauro's resolve. Near sunset, when the yard was busy and nobody watched the rear wall, he went himself to the little chamber. He placed the knotted reeds under the shelf, tucked the blackened wax behind a jar, and wedged the marked holy card beneath a loose brick by the threshold. Then he stepped back into the fading light, brushed the dust from his cuffs, and listened to the sounds around him. The mill, the hens, the low murmur of grateful workers. By the next time those same mouths spoke, he meant them to whisper something very different. Before the week was out, he had already sent a message downhill to a church commissioner named Fray Onesimo. Fray Onesimo's answer came faster than any message of mercy ever did. By the 3rd morning after Nicolas first asked for water, The fever in the house had eased enough for shutters to open and voices to rise again above a whisper. Baltasar had finally slept in a chair beside the bed. Jacinta's son was sitting up in his blanket. In the huts, mothers were blessing Abeni under their breath while they wrung out cloths in the yard. For one brief stretch of hours, San Telmo felt almost light again. That was when the commissioner arrived. He came on a dun mule with 2 churchmen behind him and a look prepared in advance. Grave, offended, useful. Fray Onesimo was not old, but he wore solemnity like a habit polished for display. His robe hem was splashed with mud from the road, and rain had curled damp strands of hair at his temples. Yet his hand rested on the crucifix at his chest, as if he rode not to inquire, but to correct. Isauro received him at the gate before Baltasar even knew he was there. By noon, the estate was already murmuring. A knot of workers gathered near the washstones, then drifted apart when they saw house servants watching. Elenita came into the kitchen, pale-faced, and said the commissioner had asked to see the rear chamber. Jacinta swore softly and set down the ladle she was holding. Abeni was in the herb room, sorting dried stems into jars when they entered. Fray Onesimo paused just inside the threshold and looked around with narrowed eyes, taking in the bunches of rue, the mint drying on twine, the jars of bark, the swept floor, the turned patch of green outside. None of it looked wicked. That, sometimes, is what most disappoints people who come hunting wickedness. Then one of his men bent near the loose brick by the threshold and drew out the charcoal-marked holy card. Another found the wax packet tucked behind a jar. And when Benito Sosa, voice shaking in all the right places, said he had seen strange signs here before dawn, fear moved through the room like cold smoke. Abeni stared at the objects as if they had risen from the dirt by themselves. "Those are not mine." Lázaro would not meet her eyes. "We saw enough to be afraid," he muttered. Fray Onesimo lifted the blackened packet between 2 fingers. "Fear is often the first mercy heaven grants before corruption spreads." By then Baltasar had been sent for. He entered at speed, coat half-buttoned, face hard. "What is the meaning of this?" The commissioner turned with measured sorrow. "A matter the church must examine, Don Baltasar. There are reports of conjuring, unblessed practices, and objects of grave concern kept where the sick have been treated." "The sick were treated with water, bark, cloth, and labor," Baltasar said. "Nothing more." Fray Onesimo's expression did not change. "Then a hearing will clear her." That word, hearing, struck the servants harder than the accusation itself. A public question is its own punishment in a place like that. By afternoon, women who had thanked Abeni a day before began crossing themselves when they passed the chamber. Workers who owed her their children's breathing lowered their voices. Fear had put on a church robe now, and fear in a robe is harder to answer. Only Jacinta did not shrink back. She stood in the kitchen later that night, turning the whole thing over in her mind while the embers settled red in the stove. She remembered the packet behind the jar, the marked card under the brick. Too neat, too ready, too much like a trap laid by hands that knew exactly where the commissioner would look. And then she remembered something else. The little iron key Isauro always kept tucked beneath the loose plank by his office desk. Long after the house went quiet, Jacinta took a lamp, crossed the corridor alone, and lifted that plank. The loose plank came up with a dry little scrape that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Jacinta froze, lamp held low, listening for footsteps in the corridor. None came. The main house had finally sunk into that exhausted quiet that follows several nights of fear. Somewhere upstairs a child coughed once and settled again. Rain ticked softly at the shutters. She set the lamp on the floor and reached into the hollow beneath the plank. Her fingers touched iron first. The key. Beyond it, wrapped in oilcloth, was something flat and stiff. She drew both out and shut the plank quickly, her breath now shallow in her chest. The key opened Isauro's desk drawer easily enough. Jacinta had watched him use it too many times not to know the turn. Inside lay common things at first: sealing wax, spare quills, twine, a church almanac. Under those, hidden beneath folded account papers, she found a narrow ledger unlike the large bound books kept for the estate. This one had no title on the cover. She opened it. Numbers by themselves mean little to many people. Yet Jacinta had spent 15 years feeding a house, where every sack, every pound, every extra purchase became kitchen consequence sooner or later. She knew when flour was short and shouldn't be. She knew when a cart claimed to carry more sugar than the bins had held. She knew enough to feel the wrongness immediately. Entries had been copied here in a tighter hand. One cart of cane sold twice under two names, tools billed for men dead a year, payments listed to workers who never existed, small thefts hidden by repetition and dust stretched over season after season. Isaro had not been stealing in sudden handfuls. He had been shaving the estate clean, sliver by sliver. Jacinta sat back on her heels, the little book open in her lap, lamp smoke prickling her nose. And then she understood the rest. A master distracted by widowhood, a household ruled by habit, a steward safe because nobody looked too closely. And now, Abeni, the woman the workers trusted, the master listened to, the one whose rise might pull attention toward every corner of San Telmo, including the ledgers. This was not superstition. It was defense. A floorboard creaked outside. Jacinta snapped the book shut and blew out the lamp so fast hot smoke bit her eyes. Darkness dropped over her like a blanket. The office door eased open. She heard breathing first, then Severino's whisper. "Cook?" She nearly cursed from fright. "Blessed Mother! Old man, do you want me dead?" He stepped in, carrying only a stub candle screened in his palm. Its dim light cut his face into planes of shadow and silver. "I saw you cross the corridor. I thought either you were hunting proof or making trouble." Jacinta held up the book. "Maybe both." By the time she showed him the pages, Refugio had been quietly fetched as well. The old cane cutter stood squinting over the entries, not because he could read them all, but because he could count names and years well enough to know the estate had been lied to. When Jacinta told them about the commissioner, the planted objects, the two field hands, Severino's one clear eye narrowed. "We cannot take this straight to the steward," he said. Jacinta let out a dry laugh. "Shall I hand it back to him then?" "No," said Refugio. "We take it where he cannot smother it." They all thought of Baltasar at once. But upstairs, the master had finally fallen asleep in a chair beside his recovering son. And by dawn, Fray Onesimo was due to begin his formal hearing in the long room of the house. Jacinta looked down at the hidden ledger in her hands, then toward the stairs. If they waited too long, Isauro would destroy everything. If they moved too soon, he might destroy Abeni first. By dawn, they chose risk over silence. Jacinta wrapped the narrow ledger back in oilcloth and hid it beneath a basket of folded linens. Severino would carry it at the right moment, not before. But Refugio would stand among the workers and speak if speaking became necessary. And Baltasar had to know enough to hold the room, but not so much so early that Isauro would smell danger and bolt before the commissioner sat down. When the first light spread across the wet courtyard, Jacinta found the master on the upper gallery outside Nicolas's room. He looked as men look after fear has loosened its grip but not yet left the body, hollow-eyed, unshaven, grateful, and dangerous. She bowed only once and said, "Do not trust the steward this morning." That was all. Baltasar studied her face, saw something there that made him stop asking questions, and simply answered, "Stay close." Fray Onesimo ordered the hearing held in the long receiving room, with its high ceiling, whitewashed walls, and saints in dark wooden frames staring down as if judgment had already taken a seat among them. The shutters were thrown open for light. Mud from many boots marked the floor near the entrance. Workers crowded the doorway and spilled into the arcade outside. House servants lined the side wall. The air smelled of damp wool, beeswax, and the tension of too many people trying not to breathe loudly. Abeni stood near the center, hands folded before her, wearing a plain dark dress Hacienda had pressed on her at sunrise so she would not face accusation in work-stained clothes. She looked tired. No wonder. She had not truly slept in days. But she did not look broken. That disappointed Isaro. He stood at Fray Onesimo's right shoulder with the careful humility of a man who wants credit for obedience. Benito and Lázaro waited near the back, pale and restless. Baltasar took his place opposite the commissioner, one hand resting on the chair behind him, as though he refused to sit while a charge like this was spoken in his house. Fray Onesimo began with solemn phrases about Christian order, the danger of hidden practices, and the duty to protect souls from confusion. He held up the marked holy card between finger and thumb. Murmurs passed through the room. Then came the wax packet, the knotted reeds, the testimony that strange things had been seen near the herb room before dawn. Benito spoke first. His voice shook in all the expected places. He said he had seen Abeni stooped near the threshold, whispering over objects he could not name. Lázaro followed, less smoothly, claiming he had seen signs scratched in the earth and heard words that chilled his blood. Neither man looked at her while he lied. Fray Onesimo turned to Abeni. "What answer do you make to these charges?" She lifted her head. "I make the same answer I would make before God. I treated fevers with water, bark, honey, clean cloth, and care. Those things are not mine." The commissioner's mouth tightened. "And the objects found among your remedies?" "I had never seen them." A few people believed her at once. A few looked away in fear. That is how such rooms work. Truth does not enter all hearts at the same speed. Then Fray Onesimo asked the question Isaro had been waiting for. "Is there any soul here," he said, "who will vouch for this woman's conduct before the church?" For one terrible moment, nobody moved. And then from the doorway, crowded with laborers, Refugio Cañedo stepped forward, took off his hat, and said, "I will." Refugio did not hurry to the center of the room. He walked like an old man who knew every eye was weighing whether his courage would hold. Hat in both hands, shoulders still damp from the morning mist, he stopped where Fray Onesimo could see him clearly. "I was the first fool on this estate to refuse her help," he said. His voice was rough, country plain, and all the more convincing for it. "My grandson was choking in his sleep. I told her he would take nothing from her hands. Before dawn I carried that same boy to her door, because pride had done nothing for him." A murmur stirred along the doorway. Fray Onesimo lifted one palm for silence. "And what did you observe there? Steam, clean cloth, bitter leaves, honey, patience?" Refugio swallowed once. No charms, no muttering over cursed objects, just a child being kept alive. Isaro shifted where he stood. "One grateful grandfather does not cleanse a room of corruption." "No," Baltasar said quietly, "but truth often begins with one man telling it." That gave others courage. A washerwoman stepped forward next, twisting her apron in both hands. Her daughter's cough had broken after 2 nights under Abeni's care. Then Toribio, hand scarred but whole, held up the palm everyone had expected to rot. "If this is sorcery," he said, voice shaking, "then it is the same sorcery that kept me working, instead of burying my hand in a rag." Laughter flickered and died quickly, but the mood in the room had shifted. Fear had cracked. Human memory was pressing through it. Fray Onesimo tried to recover the shape of authority. "These are outcomes," he said. "I ask about practices." Severino answered that one from the wall without waiting to be invited. "The practices are water boiled before use, cloths washed clean, bark steeped to draw down heat. Mint, rue, and epazote, for what ails the body. The same earth God made grows them whether a priest blesses the garden or not. The commissioner frowned. You speak boldly. I speak old, Severino said. Even a few servants hid smiles at that. But Isaro was not beaten yet. He pointed toward the seized objects laid on the side table. Then how do all these innocent people explain those? Did the wind tie the knots? Did the floor lift its own brick? That landed. You could feel the room tighten again. People who had begun to believe in Abeni now remembered the evidence had shape, weight, and presence. Fray Onesimo folded his hands over his middle and turned back to her. If these things are not yours, he said, whose are they? Abeni looked at the objects only once. Then she looked at the workers gathered by the doorway, at Jacinta standing rigid near the wall, at Baltasar holding his ground opposite the commissioner. I do not know whose hands placed them there, she said, but I know this. Whoever did it wanted fear to speak louder than the people I helped. The words hung in the room. That was when Jacinta stepped forward at last. No apron now, no kitchen spoon in hand, only the oilcloth-wrapped ledger clutched against her chest like something hot enough to burn through cloth. Her voice came out sharper than anyone expected. Then perhaps, she said, staring straight at Isaro, we should ask who in this house profits most when fear does the talking. For the first time that morning, Isaro lost control of his face. It lasted only a second, a tightening at the mouth, a flash in the eyes. But in a room strained to breaking, even a second could be enough. Jacinta stepped into the center before anyone could stop her, the oilcloth bundle held out in both hands. Fray Onesimo frowned. What is this interruption? Jacinta did not look at him first. She looked at Baltasar. Something found in the steward's office, master, hidden under his own lock. That shifted every gaze in the room. Isaro recovered quickly. A kitchen woman rifles through account papers now? This grows more shameless by the moment. Jacinta turned on him with a heat none of them had ever seen her spend outside the stove. Say shameless again, and say it while looking at the pages. Severino moved then, taking the bundle from her and placing it on the long table before the commissioner. The oilcloth was unwrapped. The narrow ledger lay there, plain and ugly as truth often is. Baltasar stepped closer and opened it himself. The room went very still. He turned one page, then another. His thumb stopped at a double entry and did not move. He knew those figures. He had signed some of the public records with his own hand. Fray Onesimo leaned in, more interested now than pious. Isaro tried to laugh. Old notes, draft tallies, nothing more. But the laugh landed nowhere. Baltasar lifted his eyes. This cart of sugar was sold once in the estate book, and once here, under another buyer. And this labor payment is marked to a man buried 2 harvests ago. No one spoke. Benito did first, but not to defend Isaro. His knees seemed to go weak under him. He half fell, half knelt, voice breaking before the whole room. He paid us, he blurted. The steward paid us to say we saw things. Lazzaro closed his eyes as if struck, and then folded beside him, words tumbling out in a rush of fear. The reeds, the wax, the card. He told us where to place them. He said the church would do the rest. A gasp ran through the gathered workers. Someone near the doorway began to weep quietly from sheer release. Refugio crossed himself. Jacinta put one hand to the wall as if the room had shifted under her feet. Fray Onesimo's face changed more slowly, but it changed. The commissioner who had arrived ready to chastise now found himself sitting over fraud, perjury, and his own embarrassment. He turned to Isaro with cold care. Do you deny their confession? Of course I deny it, Isaro snapped, too fast, too loud. They are ignorant men bribed against me. She, he pointed at Abeni, has bewitched the whole estate with gratitude and lies. Baltasar took one step toward him. That made it worse. "You used my son's sickness," he said, voice low and terrible, "to hide your theft." Isaro backed once into the corner of the table. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, he looked not clever, not composed, not superior, but cornered. Fray Onesimo rose from his chair. "Enough!" "The accusation against this woman is suspended at once, pending full review of these accounts and the false testimony just confessed. Steward, you will not leave this house." Abeni stood where she had stood all morning, hands still folded, yet the tide in the room had turned so sharply it felt almost physical. Baltasar looked at her as a man seeing clearly, in front of witnesses, what had almost been taken from her. He drew breath to speak. The room held its breath for Baltasar's next words. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Before God, before this house, and before every witness standing here," he said, "Abeni is innocent of the charge laid against her." The words seemed to strike the walls and come back larger. A sound moved through the doorway crowd, not quite a cheer, because fear had sat too long in too many chests for joy to leap out cleanly, but something close to it. Relief. Vindication before witnesses. A release of breath people had been holding since Fray Onesimo rode through the gate. Abeni herself did not move. She simply stood there with her hands still folded, as if her body did not yet trust what her ears had heard. Fray Onesimo cleared his throat and gathered what remained of his authority around him. "The accusation of forbidden practice is withdrawn," he said. "This hearing now concerns fraud, false witness, and deception brought under my seal." It was not humility. Men like him rarely offered that first. But it was enough. Isaro tried one last time. "Master, you cannot take the word of servants over years of my service." "Years of your theft," Baltasar cut in. He turned the hidden ledger toward the room, then toward the commissioner, naming figures aloud now so even those who could not read could hear the shape of betrayal. Sugar sold twice, wages collected for dead men, missing sacks disguised by false tallies. Every line sounded smaller than a pistol shot, but together they ruined a man more thoroughly than gunpowder ever could. By the time he finished, even the servants who had feared Isaro most would not look at him. Benito began to cry openly. Lazaro kept whispering, "Forgive me," to no one person and to everyone at once. Fray Onesimo motioned to the two churchmen at the door. "Don Isauro Membrillo will remain under watch until the civil authorities review these books." Only then did Isauro understand that his cleverness had reached its wall. He did not throw himself about or spit curses. Men like him collapse inward. His shoulders lost their proud set. His lips moved once without sound. When the churchmen took his arms, he did not resist. The workers in the doorway stepped aside to let him pass, and not one person lowered a gaze for him. After that, the room changed in a quieter way. Jacinta crossed to Abeni first. No speech, no tears, no fine apology. She only touched her forearm once, firmly, as one working woman might touch another after lifting the same weight. Refugio bowed his head. Severino allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Toribio lifted his healed hand as if offering it for inspection once more, and a few people laughed through the strain still trapped inside them. Baltasar watched all of it, then faced the room again. "From this day," he said, "the chamber by the rear wall and the ground beside it are under Abeni's charge alone. She will keep the infirmary of this estate, and no person here will hinder her in that duty." A murmur of assent ran through servants and workers alike. Then he added something that made even Fray Onesimo glance up. "And I will begin the petition for her freedom." The silence that followed was astonishment. That evening, after the commissioner had gone, after Isaro had been locked away, and after the house had finally begun to settle into a peace it barely remembered how to wear, Baltasar came alone to the herb room with a sealed paper in his hand. He stopped in the doorway, looking at Abeni as if the whole course of his life had bent there without warning. What he said next was meant for no witness but her. What Baltasar said in the doorway of the herb room was simple enough to fit inside one breath. "I do not want you kept here by fear, debt, or gratitude," he told her, holding out the sealed paper. "When the formal petitions are finished, you will have your freedom. And if you remain at San Telmo after that, it will be because you choose to remain." Abeni looked at the paper without taking it at first. Behind Baltasar, the yard had gone quiet, in that rare way a house quiets after a storm has passed, and everyone is listening for what the world sounds like now. From the workers' huts came the thin cry of a baby who was well enough to complain again. Somewhere near the rear wall, wet leaves stirred against one another. Her little patch of earth, newly watered, held up its first true shoots in the late light. At last she reached for the document. It came like the weight of a key laid in the palm, small, cold, and almost unbelievable, until the fingers closed around it. She looked up then, straight at the man who had bought her for 15 cents in a market full of laughter and insult. The man who had once spoken over her life in the language of ownership, and had now come to speak, at last, in the language of choice. "I will stay," she said. Her voice trembled only once. "But I will stay, standing." Something in Baltasar's face eased at those words. With the deep relief of a man who had been granted trust, he knew he had no right to demand. The months that followed did not turn San Telmo into a paradise. No honest telling could say that. But they changed its center. Isauro was taken away under guard when the civil man arrived from town. Fray Onésimo, eager to wash his own hands of disgrace, spoke carefully in the parish afterward, and did not repeat the slander. Jacinta settled into a new habit of bringing cloth, broth, and blunt advice to the herb room, without pretending she was doing anything extraordinary. Refugio never again passed Abeni without touching 2 fingers to his hat brim. Baltasar, with public witnesses and proper papers, gave her charge over the estate infirmary, so that no child of San Telmo would ever again depend on rumor while fever climbed. Years later, people did not remember the market jeers word for word. Such cruelty rarely survives in full. What endured instead was another memory: the sight of women waiting by the rear wall with jars in their hands, the smell of mint and boiled water drifting from the little chamber, and a master in widow's black pausing at dusk beside a garden he once would have walked past without seeing. Some prices are spoken in coin, and some are revealed only when the hand that was dismissed becomes the hand everyone reaches for in the dark. That evening, after the paper had changed hands, Abeni stepped outside alone and pressed one more okra seed into the damp soil beside the first green shoots. Then she covered it gently, as if laying down a promise that had finally found earth. If this story stayed with you, leave a word for it below. And if you want more long, human stories like this, stay close to the channel.